This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. Today, we're joined again by Jacob Herr. In our last episode, Jacob gave us some really valuable context and background on the Wild West and then the Wild West legendary gunman, Billy the Kid. And today, we're going to focus in on one of the most important and impressive portrayals of Billy the Kid in film or in popular media, the 1973 classic, the iconic Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, directed by Sam Peckinpaw. And this movie stars Kris Kristopherson as Billy the Kid and James Coburn as Pat Garrett. Now, Jacob Herr is a history blogger, an actor, and a scholar, and he's going to guide us through the story of one of the most larger-than-life characters in a larger-than-life period in American history, Billy the Kid. We're going to talk a lot about Billy the Kid, but we're also going to talk about the history of this movie, because this movie is really historic as well, just in and of itself. But thank you so much for joining us today, Jacob. So in the last episode, you told us how you became interested in the Old West. And my question is today, we had kind of kicked back and forth about talking about Billy the Kid in popular media, and you came with this movie. What drew you to this movie in particular, as opposed to the other portrayals of Billy the Kid?
What really drove me to Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid in comparison to other Billy the Kid movies was, despite the fact that I originally saw Young Guns 1 and Young Guns 2 in the beginning, Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid really helped me, not just from a historical sense, sort of contextualize the end of Billy the Kid's life and how things kind of wound up the way they were. But at the same time, from a movie making perspective, the grittiness, the raw, grotesque reality of the New Mexican frontier, that was just something that I did not see in any other movies, even when they tried to replicate it with other films after Peckinpah's.
Yeah, there really is something to this movie that really captures, even though and we'll get into some of the issues of the historical nature of the movie. I've always, gone back and forth of this. It's not a documentary, but it's grabbing, and any movie can't be a documentary, but does it grab something of the real story? And this grabs the real story by the collar and shakes it.
Absolutely. It's far from anything, I would say, historically accurate. No historian is going to look at this movie and they're going to critique it minute by minute to say, oh, that actually happened. Okay, that they're making up. That's complete fiction. This is a movie that you would describe as very historically authentic. Mm-hmm. It matches the imagery and it really shows the historic reality of life in New Mexico at that time, where it was anything but glamorous.
It's so funny too, and we'll get into the setting. I believe the movie was filmed in Mexico, in Durango, Mexico, which I've never been to, so I can't really speak to the setting. But there's something about New Mexico that's so special. You can drive across the border from Texas to New Mexico, and you're in two different places. As much as they are so similar in so many ways, there's some flavor between the two that are completely different. New Mexico is its own place in the whole world, and this movie captured it.
Yeah. And what you were saying earlier about the movie being shot in Durango across the border is that Durango, Mexico, throughout the course of that entire era, from the golden age of Hollywood up until what we would call the silver age after the death of the studio system in the 40s and 50s, Durango, Mexico had become a very popular place to shoot Westerns on location, just to name off the bat, in comparison with John Wayne movies and John Ford movies, which were shot at old Tucson studios in Tucson, Arizona. Durango became a popular shooting place for, just off of the top of my head, not just Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, but also some of Peckinpah's other movies, The Wild Bunch, Major Dundee, and also Marlon Brando's One-Eyed Jacks. Those were all filmed in Durango.
Oh, that's interesting. And not to go too deep into the Western genre, but weren't a lot of Sergio Leone's were either filmed in Spain, I think, or some of them in Yugoslavia. And you can kind of tell with those ones that it's not the West. It looks a lot the same, but it's not quite right.
Yeah, you can tell they were trying to match that image, but you could tell that they were trying to film within the European continent. And you definitely even see that with Sergio Leone's probably most underrated film, A Fistful of Dynamite, also known as Duck You Sucker, because he does film that both in Spain for the rural scenes, but any of the other urban scenes, those were either in LA or they were filmed, I believe, in Eastern Europe, which if you actually go to those places, you would suggest just objectively, they look like frontier regions in America and in Mexico. But in reality, you realize, you couldn't be any further away.
Oh, that's so interesting. I guess to start off, just to kind of set the table, so to speak, what's the overall synopsis of this movie? I mean, well, obviously people know this podcast. We get into spoilers here, so just be prepared for that. But people know that. What is what point in Billy the Kid's life is this movie taking place in?
Yeah. So at this point, the movie is taking place, if you're counting, depending on which version of the movie you're watching, it starts with a flashback scene or an epilogue scene in 1906 when Pat Garrett is killed by members of the Santa Fe Ring. And then it jumps immediately to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, 1880, where Pat Garrett reunites with Billy the Kid and the members of his gang, his second gang, the Rustlers. And he kind of breaks it down to him. You got to go. You got to get out of here. This place is changing, and they're looking at me to be the next sheriff. And Billy just kind of laughs it off and says, yeah, have fun with that. Because really, he's just a kid, and he's loaded with hubris, and he doesn't know what to do with his life. And he's quickly captured at the Stinking Springs gunfight. And then when he's brought to hang, he escapes. He kills the two deputies, Deputy Bell and Deputy Ollinger. And then once he escapes, you figure, okay, now he's going to go to Mexico. He's going to go to a different state, different territory, start things over. No, he goes right back to Fort Sumner with his buddies or just hanging around there, occasionally stealing some cattle, occasionally getting into a gunfight. But over time, as Pat Garrett reorganizes himself and he starts tracking down the kid again, picking up a deputy here, getting a hint over there, he slowly starts killing off members of not only Billy's gang, but also other friends that Pat Garrett has. Another sheriff played by Slim Pickens. He dies pretty early on in the film. He ends up having to go to a brothel in order to get information. And there's an entire scene of him just goofing off with some ladies of the evening. And then by the time he finally makes his way to Fort Sumner with two deputies, he finally kills off the kid pretty much in the same way that the real history tells us. And at the very end, when this very somber, almost anticlimactic ending, he has almost a bit of a existential crisis, and which is in the line to Deputy Poe when he tries to cut off the kid's trigger finger after he's dead. He says, what you want and what you get are two different things. And then come the next morning, gets up on his horse and he rides out while a young Mexican boy is throwing rocks at his horse until he's finally too far away.
I think that's what the movie really captures, is that even though Billy the Kid, I think he was only maybe about 10 years younger than Pat Garrett, give or take.
Yeah.
The movie I think in not just this movie, but generally they portray as Pat Garrett as like a much older person. He
Yeah,
wasn't that much older, but I think he had that much more maturity than and
definitely.
worldliness. You know, Billy the Kid could have gotten out and he could have gone to Colorado or Texas or anywhere and been scot free. But for whatever reason, he didn't want to leave his friends, or he just didn't have that in him to leave his stomping ground.
Yeah, the life of a renegade and a ne'er-do-well. That was the only life that he ever known. After losing his mother, losing his foster father, getting involved in the Lincoln County War, and then now that everything is over and all of his friends or anybody who gave him a legitimate chance is dead or betrayed him, he's just basically kind of embraced it and said, "This is the only life I've ever known. What else do you expect me to do?"
Yeah, and we see that Pat Garrett, he's no angel by
No,
any stretch of the imagination, and maybe the James Coburn is even less of an angel than the real Pat Garrett. I guess we don't know that exactly, but I think in the worldliness that he's picked up in just those couple of more years, that's why he doesn't romanticize his relationship with Billy the Kid, because weren't they friends?
they were friends to a certain extent. In Young Guns 2, it's kind of implied that Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid kind of rode together, got into a couple of gunfights here and there. But in reality, Pat Garrett was a buffalo hunter and a barkeep who may have encountered Billy the Kid, working as a bar hand. So the extent of their friendship is very mysterious, but what we can understand, it was just kind of what we would say a guy who, I don't really know him personally, but he's still my friend.
Oh, kind of definitely more associates than you would say, like they're not best buds by any stretch of the imagination.
Confidants or anything like that, no.
Kris Kristopherson is about 15 years older than when he's in about 36-ish, 36 or so when this movie was filmed. And James Coburn, I think he was in his 40s, where Pat Garrett was just about 30 when these events happened. Why did Peckinpaw pick people who were a fair bit older than the historical characters?
I don't think it was really a matter of age. I think Peckinpah casted, Kristofferson and Coburn because of just their ability as actors. And granted, Kristofferson was mostly known just as a country star in the music industry before getting into acting, and he was able to prove himself. I have a couple of other movies that have Kristofferson as an actor, most famously A Star is Born with Barbara Streisand. But James Coburn had already established himself as a Western actor, The Magnificent Seven. And by that time, and he had also worked with Peckinpah in the past with Major Dundee. And he was kind of part of that stock company, what was referred to as the Sam Peckinpaw stock company of these character actors who always wound up working with Peckinpah, either for the convenience of staying relevant in the industry or just an easy way to make money. That would include, and much like the actors that you see in the supporting cast of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, L.Q. Jones, who plays a member of the Kids gang, Harry Dean Stanton, who also did Cool Hand Luke with Paul Newman, Lucas Skew, who was also an Easy Rider. So there's a lot of character actors, and they just kind of kept following the pattern. But their performances were spot on, even if you don't know who they are or what other projects they did in the past.
What did you think about Kristofferson's portrayal of the kid?
I very much enjoyed it. I mean, comparing it to, let's say, Emilio Estevez as Billy the Kid in the Young Guns movies, I think he kind of gives a little bit more of a cynical edge to the character, where he kind of has this attitude of, I don't give a damn about anything. because I've grown up in a world where violence is the only way one survives. It's the ultimate form of survival of the fittest. And even if that means that I have to end up killing somebody who I thought was my friend just so that I could live the next day, then so be it. It's very sociopathic behavior, but in an environment where everybody sort of had that mentality, what else can you really do?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to portrayals, like Emilio Estevez played the kid as a young person, I think, like as somebody without that maturity, where I think that with Kristopherson, that something came through with that swagger and that toughness came through with Kristopherson.
Yeah.
And what did you think about Pat Garrett's portrayal?
I would say he definitely had a very strong sense of stoicism to his character. This was a guy who recognized that things were changing. He had to change with the times and he had to fall in with the system. And he couldn't live the same life that Billy and the rest of the other outlaws at Fort Sumner were living and were very resistant to. Pat Garrett almost very painfully takes the job. And whenever you see him having to kill somebody or try to get information that leads him to the kid, he doesn't take any pride in being the sheriff of Lincoln County, because even when he goes to Santa Fe and meets up with Governor Wallace, played by Jason Robards rather wonderfully, even though it is a pretty small part, some of the other cattle kings and cattle barons are there at the sit down, and they say, "Oh, we'll offer you $1,000 reward. You can take 500 right now." And he just very pessimistically says, "Well, I aim to bring the kid in." He feels like he's being used, and frankly, to a certain extent, I don't blame him, because the way that he ends, dying in 1906, that you see in the very beginning of the movie, he is just completely, broken. He recognizes that entire sense of what that frontier philosophy was. You can go out, change your destiny in this wide, vast frontier. They chewed me up and they spat me out like a piece of gum. And it's sad.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, it's absolutely. And I think that it's so hard for us today to wrap our minds around what the level of violence there was in these towns. I was doing a little research about the Bonnie and Clyde story, and one of the Texas Rangers, he was a sheriff in one of these border towns near Mexico, Texas, New Mexico border. This little town had 100 murders in a year. New York City, everybody cries when there's 400 murders in a year in a city of 8 million people. Like, this is a small town with probably a couple of thousand people in it. I mean, the level of absolute violence that is in there is just unfathomable to people today, I think.
Yeah. And this is and I'm listening to this coming from, just outside of Chicago. Everybody says, "Oh, it's murder capital USA." Well, I mean, coming from a city, where there's like between 400 and 700 homicides a year, that's not really something, we're not trying to make that out to be a joke or anything like that. It isn't, but it's a very, it's a very callousing experience.
Yeah, for sure. When you look at the level of violence that has happened in the past. Now, one part of this movie that really fascinated me was with the score and with Bob Dylan in it. I thought that was so cool. Where did that come from?
Supposedly, I mean, Bob Dylan, a man who is an amazing songwriter and kind of a good musician. Vocally, he sounds like total garbage, if that's my personal opinion. And especially in his
hate mail here.
He's just as bad. Yeah. His acting talent is, but he supposedly got the role as Alias from literally because he was only supposed to do the soundtrack for the movie, mainly just instrumentals. And he wound up finding out where Sam Peckinpaw was staying at a hotel. And he just grabbed a chair, sat outside the hotel door, and started playing the music and singing outside of his hotel room until he finally opened up the door and said, "Come on in. I don't know who you are, but your music is amazing. I want you to put in my movie and I'll give you a part."
Man, though, if I don't know if in many movies I've experienced when he starts singing "Knocking on Heaven's Door" after that murder or after that killing, and then that whole scene like just shivers run up your spine.
Yeah, because originally, and depending on which version you watch, because there was a studio cut, there was Peckinpah's personal cut, and then there was kind of a cut that blends both the Peckinpaw version and the studio version together. Sometimes, depending on which version, you either hear "Knocking on Heaven's Door" from the studio, from the album, you only hear the instrumental, or you don't hear it at all. And so depending on which version and how it's used, that really does affect the viewer's experience of the movie. And the first time that I saw it, that was the one where "Knocking on Heaven's Door," vocals and everything, was used appropriately. And man, does it just put shivers down your spine.
That's a good, I think a good time to bring that up. You bring up that there was 3 different cuts to the movie, and maybe before we get into some of the reasons why there was these different cuts, what's maybe some of the big differences somebody might see? I believe, I'm not sure which, I watched it on Amazon Prime. I'm not sure which cut that was. I don't think it was the studio cut, but I don't know if it was the director's cut or not. It might have been that hybrid cut.
Yeah. The version that I saw before we're recording this, that was the version that they have on YouTube, and that is the hybrid cut, where it has the epilogue scenes in the sepia tone, brown and white of Pat Garrett's death in the beginning, but at the same time, in the opening scene at Fort Sumner, where they're doing the target practice on the chickens, it keeps alternating back and forth from 1906 to 1880 as the chicken heads are getting shot off.
Oh, okay, that's the one I saw.
As Garrett's getting shot. But then when you see that movie, the scene where Black Harris, played by L.Q. Jones, he's finally shot and he's crawling his way towards Garrett. That was the version where I heard only the instrumental for "Knocking on Heaven's Door." The effect was there. It just didn't stand as tall.
Were there some other major differences between the cuts?
The other major differences between the cuts, I would say the studio version, they tried to make it a little more appropriate to I would say the studio formula, what we would refer to as the wholesome Western. And when that version came out and took it away from Peckinpaw as he was editing it, supposedly he went up into, depending on where you hear this from, he either went up to the screen or he went into the projector booth and he on the celluloid, or he pissed on the screen. You certainly couldn't get away with that, but that was kind of his attitude towards the studio by then. Because they had done that to him before with Major Dundee, taking his original intention and his philosophy that he was trying to put into the movie, and they just snatched it away from him so that they could try to make the most money out of it. Yeah, because Peckinpaw was one of those artists where he was a perfectionist. He would work on the script. He wrote the script alongside, in this version, with somebody else. And he had already kind of visioned each scene in his head for about a year. He was a perfectionist, but to the point where it led to a lot of extremely toxic relationships on set, a lot of alcohol abuse. And by the time he would wrap up shooting and go into the editing room, the studio would say, you took the budget out of control. You're taking this out of control. We're relinquishing your power, and and we're going to recut this so that we can try to get our money back. And by then, he was just like, fine, you've done it to me before. Go ahead and take it.
It's so interesting with Peckinpah. Uh, where did he come from? What was his, because he's pure artist. What
Yeah.
he had a pretty established career to this point. Was he always this difficult in his filming?
By that point, he had become extremely difficult. But as he was beginning his career, he grew up in Southern California, not outside of Los Angeles, but like in the rural areas of California. And by the time he went into the military, he served in the Pacific during World War II. And when he came back, he originally started out directing theater, stage theater, but then he realized the big moneymaker was in film and also in television, where he was a writer for shows like Gunsmoke and The Westerner. And he began kind of taking his philosophy of breaking down and showing the real grittiness and the callousness of the frontier and putting that into cinema. And he really had his breakthrough in around 62 or 63 with Ride the High Country. He did it again in 65 with Major Dundee. But Major Dundee was a bit of a turning point for him, because that's when he was experimenting with the idea of how do you physically show violence on camera, especially in terms of gun violence in this Western frontier. And he doesn't hold back. And with many of his other movies, not only Major Dundee, but most famously The Wild Bunch, the camera, almost as if it slows down, time slows down when somebody gets shot or somebody gets hurt, and you see the blood gushing out, you see it coming out of the wound, and you see how slow people's reactions are, the pain and the anguish in their faces. That was something that he created, and it virtually did not exist prior to him. If you watch any of those older movies in black and white, if it's like a noir film or something like that, how do they show somebody getting shot? Oh, they cover up the wound and then they over dramatically fall to their death like it's Shakespeare. Peckinpah was like, that's not reality, and I'm going to show you what reality really is, regardless if it's making people throw up in their popcorn bags.
Oh yeah, that scene where Billy the Kid breaks out of prison, and all throughout he's being harangued by the one sheriff, and the other sheriff doesn't really care so much. You know, he's just there, and then Billy winds up killing both of them. And the way they slowed it down, like it's brutal, even though the effects aren't as maybe graphic and gruesome as you might see today. Like just the emotion that comes through and the portrayal of it is very emotional.
Yeah.
And that's something to say, because a lot of times you see, and the older effects kind of ruin it. But I think in this movie, you don't even notice that the effects or the blood looks a little, not like real blood or something like that, but everything comes through.
Yeah, it does. It really does come through. And especially depending on which version that either tones that down or they just go full throttle, it's you can really tell that was, by then, 1973, that was Peckinpah's Hallmark card.
And then Peckinpah, a lot of what you read about behind the scenes was that he was really pretty deep into his alcoholism at this point. Was there as many examples before this as the alcoholism, or is this when it really bubbled to the forefront and it affected how things were going?
That's really how it affected how things were going. 1965 with Major Dundee, that really was the beginning, because the studio was interfering with him. He was going severely over budget, and that perfectionist philosophy that he had when he imagined every scene in his mind, and if his actors weren't portraying it in front of the camera, he wouldn't get up in your face and yell at you, but he would just get really low toned, get up in your face and said, that's not what You know that's not what I want. I've seen better from you. Stop. To the point where actors would just, they didn't want anything to do with them. And they would sometimes walk off the set, but then the next day, because they remembered, oh, I'm under a contractual obligation to work, they show up back on set. L.Q. Jones was interviewed about that. Peckinpaw fired him 19 times over the course of those movies. Major Dundee, Wild Bunch, Ballad of Cable Hogue, and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid.
As an actor, because like I think about it, like having a demanding boss can be good, but I think acting is such a different thing. As an actor, do you want that person who holds you to that director who holds you to the absolute standard and who maybe doesn't put a fine, who doesn't sugarcoat it, who cuts to the bone? Or do you want the more of a person who's coaching and lifting you up to be your best?
I want somebody that's a little bit both, where you get that emphasis of, I want you to go 110% and I'm not going to sugarcoat things because this is a business and we have to make sure that what we're doing is quality. But at the same time, you got to recognize that we are human beings and we're not machines that can guarantee a satisfying product every single time. Coming from the experience of being a stage actor, it's not like being on film where, okay, you can record it and then with a little bit of editing, you can get it right on track. With stage performances, if I'm doing, say, I just did a production of Catch Me If You Can, the musical, no one experience or one show, if I do it on a Friday night, it's nothing. It may not be anywhere near what that same experience is going to be on a Saturday night or a Sunday night. That's really that's the wonder of being a stage actor. And I can see why a man like Peckinpaw, who started out in theater at UCLA, decided to move into film and television, because that experience is permanent. And no matter what generation discovers the film or the episode, they're going to get that same experience over and over.
Yeah, I think that is something that maybe he was expecting a different level of performance from them at that point. I don't know. Kris Kristopherson, you had said he had been in a few things before that. Was that his sort of breakout at that point?
That was sort of his breakout as an actor, because that was before he became well known as an actor and a musician for A Star Is Born. And he ended up working with Peckinpaw again in 1978 with Convoy, which was turned into an extremely cheesy country song by C.W. McCall. But by that time, he was just starting to break into into film acting, and working with a man like Peckinpaw, who was this borderline sociopathic perfectionist, mad genius of the film industry, was a very hard baptism of fire for him. Many times they would argue over things, something from as simple as either the writing in the script or how a certain scene was shot, or just the fact that they didn't film the movie chronologically. He walked in expecting the movie to be shot in order as it appears in the script. Anybody who works on a film set will say very rarely does that ever happen. You're always alternating between either shooting the very end, or you'll go somewhere in the middle. You'll start shooting in the beginning, or you might have to shoot something in between the middle and the end. And for an actor who's trying to memorize lines from a chronological tactic as a stage actor, that's what I'm comfortable with. That could drive you insane, especially if you don't have any acting experience, which people like Kristopherson and Bob Dylan, who basically, he wasn't even a character in the script. They just gave him a part because he's Bob Dylan and he was doing the soundtrack. That's going to cause a lot of mental stress and anxiety.
It seemed almost like from what I had read and what you're explaining, it sounds like Kris Kristopherson was kind of more of a pain than Peckinpaw. Peckinpaw's the boss there, and yeah, he's an alcoholic and he was drunk a lot of the time. But Kristopherson kind of trying to direct where the direction of this movie was going to, and giving Peckinpaw a hard time seems like he's overstepping his bounds a bit. Like maybe he was a little big for his britches in his role. What do you think? Do you think that's accurate?
I would say that is kind of accurate, because Kristopherson wasn't really any better than Peckinpaw. Granted, he wasn't the alcoholic mess that Peckinpaw was, but Kristopherson had no qualms of like grabbing like his friends and members of his band to be extras in the movie. I think the actor who plays the character Beaver, that's his name in the script, he had no lines. And so he would literally just ad hoc them on the set when the cameras were rolling. So anything that, say, Luke Askew or Harry Dean Stanton said, he would just repeat it and just make it part of his character.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Is there anything, did any of that you know of, did any of the more veteran actors have anything to say about how, because it kind of sounds like a nightmare of a production.
Yeah, I would say there was a silver lining in the case, because James Coburn was probably the one with the most experience on set, maybe with the only exception being Slim Pickens. They were probably the two most veteran actors on the set, maybe with the exception of throwing in Jason Robards also. Those three, they were probably the most professional on the set. Robards, and the fact that he was only on screen for about 10 minutes and maybe a little bit longer with Pickens, because he started out as a rodeo clown and he had acted in other movies and stuff like that as a character actor. But also Coburn for The Magnificent Seven and other stuff like that. His stoicism playing Pat Garrett, that was also part of his own personality, where he kind of sees the chaos that's happening, but he still does his job because, that's his contractual obligation with the studio. He may not like what's happening, but he's still going to try to do what he can to make it, a quality picture.
Do you think that, you had kind of alluded to this earlier, do you think that this was kind of maybe not the thing that killed the Western, but it definitely put an end to the 60s, 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s version, John Wayne version of the Western? Because we really don't get a resurgence of the Western until almost 20 years later.
Yeah, into the 90s with, Dances with Wolves and Unforgiven and stuff like that. The 70s at that point, as part of the revisionist movement that not only Peckinpaw was also a part of, but also European directors like Sergio Leone, Sergio Corbucci, they were really kind of breaking down a lot of the barriers that the family-friendly Western from the end of the 30s up until the end of the 60s had such a strong grip in Hollywood and in media. You couldn't go to any theater or to any TV station without a Western coming on. To put that into perspective, in today's time, it's kind of like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where, how many Marvel movies, just a personal question, just you don't have to be right on it or anything, but how many Marvel properties do you think are coming out just in the past 2 years?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I would have to say probably at least a dozen. I mean, including Netflix and that sort of thing, maybe more than that.
To put that into perspective, in 1958 alone, there were 50 Western TV shows.
Oh, wow.
On television. There were only 3 channels, and they all adhered to that conservative philosophy of where the frontier is whitewashed, where nobody cursed, very few people drank, And whenever violence did occur, it was either for a moral sense of the greater good. And very rarely did you ever see other minority groups who actually made up a very strong cultural influence in this part of not only history, but also in that geographic region. Very rarely do you ever see their perspectives outside of maybe just being a token stock character. Peckinpaw, alongside Leone and Corbucci and all those other guys, they took that concept, flipped it around its head, and kind of showed the studio, how hypocritical you are in depicting this time and in this place. And that it actually has real consequences, because that was the beginning of the counterculture, the Vietnam, political cynicism. And that really culminated, as I said in the beginning before recording, with Mel Brooks's Blazing Saddles. He was the one that finally took that cash cow and shot it in the face with a big old smile.
Yeah, you can kind of see why it took so long after that to reboot the genre, because it took a generation to reimagine what the Western should be. And you get gritty Westerns like Unforgiven, of somebody who was like the kind of, in a lot of ways, Clint Eastwood was one of the people who put the nail in the coffin of the John Wayne Western. And then he comes and redoes it.
Yeah. And he was a part of that, because before getting involved with Sergio Leone, he was in Rawhide in the film.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Rowdy Yates. So he already saw that, that this wasn't right. This wasn't authentic, and it doesn't reflect reality. And so that entire movement, I would say objectively, was well-deserved, not just for the sake of cinema, but also for the sake of culture.
I think now that the conversation's kind of shifted to the Western genre, what do you think about the kind of the Westerns that are coming out today? Do you think they honor that new thought, or that, and maybe where do you see Westerns going, and where do you want them to go?
I think really the Western at this point is kind of not only is it just a fringe genre at this point, because we see remakes of older films, 3:10 to Yuma, True Grit, and I've even heard here and there talk of them remaking The Wild Bunch, either in a modern setting or in its original setting in the Peckinpaw film. But also more emphasis on the Western as a parody after Blazing Saddles, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs on Netflix, or sticking with that true revisionist medium or postmodernist medium of sticking to the grim, vicious reality with shows like Hatfields and McCoys and Hell on Wheels. I would say from a historian's angle, visually, it's much more accurate. Not to say definitely even more recently, they were finally able to make a TV movie that wrapped up Deadwood, HBO's Deadwood, that ran for 3 seasons. It was canceled abruptly. And then finally we got an ending to it that wrapped everything together.
I would kind of like to see, I loved Unforgiven. I think I saw that at like just the perfect age. I think like mid-teens, that it just, to me, that as much as anything, it was the West reimagined, and it had that real taste of the West, but also the death of the West too. Like that's when the West, that's what the time period that movie portrayed, is that the West is kind of going away and something new is coming in. And that's what it felt like to me, that the movie was also that our old idea of the Old West is going away and we're bringing in this new version of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Unforgiven is actually I would say it would probably be my dad's favorite Western outside of maybe The Outlaw Josie Wales. But with Unforgiven, you can definitely see that. And I agree with that, where not just in terms of how the movie is made, but also from the score, from the story to the performances, that there is nothing romantic, there is nothing sweeping, there's no great orchestra, like say from something from John Ford or Stagecoach or any of that. And it fits a lot more with like what we would call like the tragedies of Shakespeare and Ibsen and Anton Chekhov, which are much closer to reality and the human condition. It's not a fairy tale. It's a complicated reality where very few people are innocent and a lot of other people are more guilty than others. And that's up for the individual viewer to decide.
That's what I would love to see more of myself. I don't want to see another remake because there's too many remakes, and not that they fall short, but it's just not the same thing. And it seems to me like it's a little lazy. I would like to see good stories set in the Old West, period.
Yeah. The closest thing I can really think of outside of maybe, I know they made Hostiles with Christian Bale and Wes Studi, very, very amazing Native American actor, that was also kind of showcasing that same philosophy as Unforgiven at the end of the Indian Wars in the 1890s. But also at the same time, you have a little bit more of the political commentary about naturalism and environmentalism with The Revenant, Leonardo DiCaprio, and their director, about the idea of the tranquility of the American frontier as early as the 1820s along the Missouri River and into the plains. That's only starting to become cultivated by European and American societies.
It's another thing that we've been talking a lot about film and TV, but in popular culture, have you ever played the Red Dead Redemption games or seen them?
I hold both of those games very close to my heart. I have played them numerous times, and every time I play it, it just hits me every single time, either the same way or it just hits me differently, because sometimes I'll play the game and I'll try to go morale wise, or I'm going to do all the wrong decisions and see how that turns out, or make all the right decisions and see how that ends out. Or sometimes just something a little more realistically, where how would myself as an individual, what decisions would I make in that place and in that time? And it's that weird gray area. It's weird, but I love it. And I think more video games and other forms of like media that depict the West or the end of the West, they just really hit it with the ball. And I think that's the path that they should keep going.
Yeah, I think that, and that expands it because it makes it so much more personal, that you're experiencing this time period that's so critical in American history, and you can completely immerse yourself in it in a way that you can't on TV and you can't in film.
No. And I think, and this is just a weird way to kind of round it out with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, I think that's sort of the reason why Peckinpaw casted Bob Dylan as Alias in the very last minute, because if not to do like a big character study or anything, but I think the reason why he's in that movie, and there's so much emphasis on that character, even though he has very little to do with the plot, he's like a narrator, or at least like a tour guide for the viewer. He's the one that we identify with the most because he witnesses Billy escape. He ends up quitting whatever job that he had in Lincoln, and he goes off to Fort Sumner and adopts that name, Alias. We don't know anything about him, but he ends up bonding with Billy because of that first impression. And I think for a lot of people going in, learning about the kid, learning about Billy the Kid from other movies and stuff like that, that's very similar. We are attracted to that outlaw image, that social rebel image. But then when you really break down and you see him as a person, it's like a living caricature, and it's saddening and it's very sobering. And they don't really show it that much in the character of Alias, because they kind of ditched the character near the latter end of the movie. But that was something that clicked when I watched the movie more recently. He is kind of that entrance hole for us to kind of contextualize or put ourselves into that plot, into that environment.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. A huge thanks goes out to our guest today, Jacob Herr. Links to learn more about Jacob Herr and his various projects can be found at www.jacobherr.com or in the show notes. I would very much appreciate if you left a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. Those reviews really go a long way in helping people learn about Beyond the Big Screen and let me know what you're thinking about the show. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History Page. You can send me a good old-fashioned email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. We can talk about movies, the history, background, and context behind movies, and just great stories that really should be on the big screen. If you'd like to hear more discussions on the real Wild West, let me know. Jacob and I would love to talk more about this topic in particular because I know it's fascinating to me. Links to all of this and more can be found at a2zhistorypage.com, and I will see you next time beyond the big screen.